You have failed me for the last time. Hmm? Oh, hi. I'm OmnusI. Welcome to the Lair of OmnusI, round two. Later. Welcome back to the Lair of OmnusI. I am, of course, OmnusI, and we are here to reopen the lair with a new generation of videos that I hope will be useful and entertaining to you. Again, the primary focus is going to be on our tabletop role-playing games that we so dearly love. And I am, of course, eager to share my ambitions and my experience with you to hopefully inspire or to persuade you to delve into the hobby yourselves. So, this season of videos, we're going to be addressing more topical videos about issues that people have with various games, delving into game design, why things are the way they are, and hopefully getting people to look at games in different ways that may be more useful or more, well, how can I say it? Maybe give a second chance to a game that you had a problem with earlier. That's a little too preachy. Let's try this again. Hello, viewers. I am OmnusI, your host once more. Once more. Eh. Hello, heroes. I am OmnusI, back once more in the Lair of OmnusI for another round to carry on with our series of expounding upon my experience and passion for games of all sorts, primarily tabletop role-playing games. And you are most welcome here to this more topical round of video content, rather than just looking at general overviews and trying to be instructive. This time we're going to delve into issues that have either been plaguing certain people or keeping abreast of the issues that are going in the hobby industry at this time. So, today we're going to look at something that I have been hearing about for quite some time, a certain dissatisfaction with a style of games that I myself do enjoy, the particular style, and I think sometimes they get roughed up without a proper defense. Also, it's fair to acknowledge the weaknesses of this style, but I'll let you be the judge on how this all plays out. Today we're going to talk about the system of hit points in role-playing games. Enjoy. Now, hit points are something that have been in games for quite a long time. Even from the earliest generations of war games to video games, and of course, role-playing games are no exception. It is something that some of the earliest role-playing games have had, which they have absorbed from their forebears, and still exist in many games today. Some modern games have done away with hit point systems, going with systems that are even more abstract in some cases or more realistic in others. But to look at hit points in general, it's important that we're all on the same page and understand what hit points are and what they do for a game. So hit points, my suspicion is that hit points first came in from wargaming. It was important to have some level of realism as far as differentiating one unit from another, a better, more powerful unit from a weaker unit that costs less or has some fundamental flaws. For example, some peasant infantry, some militia that was brought up, is generally going to be inferior to armored knights. Therefore, to represent the extra punishment that a unit like that could give, there's two ways of doing it. Either you can assume that their armor is going to make them harder to hurt and give them some sort of classification for their armor, or you can say that they simply can take more punishment and have a certain amount of arbitrary hit points that have to be taken down before the unit is taken out of play. I am not I don't play a lot of war games, to be honest, so I'm suspecting that's probably where the first usage of hit points came from. Then, of course, we have video games that have used hit points. Either they use a numerical hit point or maybe some sort of a bar that represents how much punishment a particular unit can have. And in tabletop role-playing games, many of them use a hit point-based system to keep track of how much damage an individual character could take. So what hit points are a useful way of keeping track how much damage a particular unit can sustain before it's removed from play. In a video game or a tabletop role-playing game, it's oftentimes not important to determine if that kills the character, just gets them out of the game. In a video game, it might count as a character that's knocked out, or it could be a character that's killed. If you're playing a game like Golden Axe that has swords and axes, they're probably killed, whereas a game like Final Fight, where the weapons are more rare and you're mostly fighting with fists, one of your characters may be the mayor of the city, you're probably not fighting to kill. So those characters may be assumed to be only knocked out until you get a sword and start hacking them. But I digress. In a war game, it's even less important. A unit that's broken and can no longer exist as a unit can safely be said not to necessarily have killed everybody involved, but may have scattered the unit so they're no longer a force on the battlefield. Generally, in terms of victory conditions, that can be just as useful. And hit points in role-playing games certainly can be the same. It can be a measurement of when you're out of hit points, your character is dead, or it can be that your character is disabled and needs help badly. And what they're used for in general is to make the game run easily and with a minimum of details that truly may not be necessary for the game that they're being used with. It's not important to know that this particular peasant infantry has a slashed forearm. If he's not a combatant anymore, then he might as well be dead. Similarly, in a game such as Dungeons and Dragons, keeping track of individual injuries on a person is counterproductive. It's more realism than the game requires. And therefore, a hit point system has worked quite well over the years, where a player can watch their character's dwindling hit points and know that the gravity of their situation as they get more and more injured. But important to understand is the assumption that hit points are not an attempt to make a realistic claim towards an amount of damage. A hit point is a representation of how much that character has left to stay in the theater that the game takes place in. For an adventurer, they will probably fight until they're actually knocked out or dead, so hit points are something of an analog to one's personal health, with 0 being the state that they can no longer fight. And none of these games really assume that there is a direct analog of a 2-inch cut on the arm is X amount of hit points. That kind of preciseness would honestly be wasted or bog down such a game terribly. It was impossible for a game that's already very complicated with lots of units, like a large war game, or a video game that's really only interested in having enemies that are only as deep as beating them up a few times before they're out of the game. In terms of Dungeons and Dragons or other games that use hit points in role-playing games, generally they tend towards more heroic themes, concentrating on the concept that a person who is skilled and generally central to the story can overcome great odds and fight against situations that a normal man would be overwhelmed by. The reason that a person can, say, continue fighting at full effectiveness at, say, 3 hit points is because none of those wounds that they took are completely lethal. Certainly they took some bruising, some bashing, but the great wounds that would be near mortal don't come until the very end of a person's pool of hit points. So that kind of abstraction is used to free the game master and players from having to detail every bump, every bruise, every injury. So that's generally what hit points are there for. They're there to make the game easier for you. And quite honestly, some people misunderstand that. They think that hit points are, I've taken a slash from a sword that does 10 points of damage. That means that stronger people don't take as much of a slash because they have a large pool of hit points. So if I hit somebody with my little wakizashi here, and I slash and do 6 points of damage, I do more, but we'll use that, against a rank commoner, that might outright kill them. Against a veteran warrior, they're likely to barely notice. Yet, I use the same cut, the same amount of force, and if both of them are, say, for intensive argument, say they don't have a stitch of armor on them, theoretically, my blow should be just as lethal for anybody because experience and gaining of power don't mean your skin is any thicker or that you have more blood in you or spare organs to be slashed. It just means that you're good at not dying from a blow that would kill a normal man because you've gotten out of the way, because you have learned to avoid danger, your reflexes are better, what have you. In some cases, you may assume that you have more reserves of energy so that you can fight longer and dodge blows more effectively than a character who get worn down in a battle. Having been somebody who's played in live-action role-playing, I can tell you fatigue is just as deadly as a really skilled opponent. If your arm starts to get tired, you're not going to fight as effectively. And hit points can be the abstraction of hit points can also help with fatigue. It's also why healing can be so miraculous. It's not that you're actually healing cuts and scrapes, it's you're getting your wind under you again. So, hit points are useful. They're a tool, and they're a central core for the combat system of a lot of role-playing games, video games, war games, etc. Why have they been so popular over the years? Well, it's because they work. Your character that is important, that has earned advancement and experience, can enjoy a certain level of assurance when fighting lesser opponents. The chances of a weak opponent, say a rank-and-file goblin, against an adventurer who has earned levels of experience and skill, that assault from that goblin is going to be routine to them. They'll have seen things like that before, and they will know how to handle that fight better than a rank amateur would. The goblin comes at them, crazily waving his sword. Maybe the veteran warrior, say the goblin hits. To a veteran warrior, that warrior sees the blow coming and maybe partially deflects it, or maybe turns the blow on their armor, expending some of their personal energy there, but not taking a wound that's going to cause them great grief. Whereas the amateur, a common man or a low-level adventurer, taking that same blow doesn't have the luxury of experience to draw from or the pools of energy, perhaps. And when that blow comes in, they handle it badly and instead take a bleeding wound from a result, or maybe outright kill, depending on how lucky the goblin was. So, hit points can represent certainly a person's personal skill and ability. Also, that also harkens to damage. What does damage represent? Damage represents potential. A blow that does 1 point of damage as opposed to a blow that does 12 points of damage, the 1 point blow is not going to kill anybody but the weakest. Just a pinprick of damage. Unless, of course, you're down to 1 hit point, in which case, even that thrust, you aren't able to deflect at all. You are defenseless before it, and if it's a thrust that's designed to try to hurt you, it's going to hurt you to the point of, death or unconsciousness. Whereas that 12-point swing is always going to be one that is, potentially lethal. It's just that the veteran will have the means to avoid that lethal blow, whereas a lesser would not. And that is something that we call a convention. It is something that the game knows is not realistic, accepts so that the game can go on. It is an abstraction. It is just taking into account a great number of things. Your experience. Sometimes just how important you are to the story. If you've ever read a great novel, very few of them are going to have one of the heroes killed off early by a relatively inconsequential foe. That person who dies is usually going to be somebody to make the story seem, or that battle seem like it had more gravity than otherwise it might have. But generally, heroes don't go down to a simple dagger thrust from a weak opponent like a goblin or a kobold. That's for the lessers to do, to prop up the heroes and make them seem cooler. That is why the idea of hit points and expanding your hit points every time you hit a certain benchmark, your experience level, and gaining a pile of more hit points, just makes your character a little bit more important in the story that's unfolding in the role-playing game. So, in a situation where experience would not help you, say if you're caught in these, Dragon's Breath you could duck and cover from to some extent, hold your breath against the poison gas, dodge out of the worst of the flames. So your saving throws and other things that decrease as you get better, that can also account to experience as well. And your ability to survive a lot of damage because you have a lot of hit points also can represent your experience. But something like global effect damage, like falling damage, for instance. If I go into the military and I do 10 years of ground service, I've gotten a lot of experience. I've been shot at, maybe I've been shot, maybe I've shot other people. I've trained as a soldier. I'm very skilled. If I fall off a 3-story building and another guy falls off a 3-story building, I'm not going to be able to just get up and brush the dust off because I have all these hit points because of my experience. Hit points kind of fall on their face when you have certain types of damage and certain means of threatening your character that, again, a very experienced character can laugh off, whereas a less experienced character might expire or be gravely injured. And in that case, my viewpoint that the convention of hit points also works to determine how important your character is to the story. Heroes don't die from a fall very often. Can happen, but it's relatively rare. That's because the extra hit points is the safety net that's awarded to the characters over all that experience kind of spells out their destiny to not die to that kind of a circumstance, very often at least, giving them some measure of protection if they've earned some experience. Games like Dungeons and Dragons and other games that use hit points don't claim to be realistic. They generally have a lot of abstractions in them, different conventions that make the game flow well. For example, the entire concept of leveling. Hitting an arbitrary point of experience in which your combat skills and many of your other skills just all get better at a time. Well, that's not very realistic at all. But again, from the concept of, wargaming and as something that we've just kind of come to accept in a lot of those games, those of us who play them, it's not that far of a stretch to just say this is the way it is. Especially when that unlocks special abilities and things. Wizards gaining new levels of spells, or another class gaining new abilities and such. You assume that through experience they unlock deeper mysteries, figure out new technique, and all these different assumptions come naturally to these systems. Now, that's what hit points are and why we use them. They work. They work well for what they do. There are people who cannot easily fathom or stomach the idea that a person who has gone through 10 levels can shrug off a 30-foot fall without any issue. That it has no chance of killing them. Even if they fell headfirst onto their necks from 30 feet up, they'd still walk away. Well, there's an argument there. I've never heard of any person who's fallen 30 feet directly on their head and walked away from it. In most cases, your brains are dashed out on the floor, your neck is broken, what have you. That's going to kill you no matter what. But in taking the context of experience and what hit points are for, that person's not going to fall on their head. It would take something pretty extraordinary for that circumstance to happen, and they would generally learn how to fall in such a way that they could roll with it. In parkour, if you watch videos, you can see people take tremendous falls that could seriously injure a person, and because they learn how to land and roll, they avoid most of the kinetic damage to their bodies, and basically roll it off by using that energy to roll, spring, and in other words, protect themselves through their motion. There have been incidents, recorded incidents, where people have fallen from tremendous heights and survived. People who've fallen out of airplanes and landed with minimal injuries. It's the exception, certainly, and in many cases those people don't have any particularly great experience. But when you can take into account that wizards can throw fireballs and other supernatural things are possible, perhaps there's a greater incident of the beings that decide the fates of mortals aren't quite so ready to cut the cord on somebody who's got more experience from something like a fall. So if an abstraction or some sort of a convention in a game only works as long as you accept the convention as necessary and good. Once you have a problem with a particular convention, it's going to constantly rear its head, isn't it? So, as far as games that don't use hit points, there's usually some other means of tracking how much damage they've taken, and most of those games, for the sake of realism, have some sort of detrimental effect to the injuries that you've taken. Not only do they bring you closer to death, but they also usually impair your abilities in some way, shape, or form. Shadowrun, for example, has a damage track. The more damage that you take as you roll down the track, you're going to have penalties when you try to do things because the pain of your injuries or possibly the injury themselves stop you from operating at peak efficiency. In some cases, it can be extremely detrimental as you get more and more injured. Another game like Werewolf that is quite abstract itself. Everybody has a set amount of levels of injury that they can take. First one's free. You can be bruised without having any kind of negative impact. But then you start having penalties to your dice pools as you have taken damage. So there's a track that you use, and you fill in damage as you take it. In the case of games like Vampire or Werewolf, where you're playing a supernatural creature, there are different kinds of injury that you may be able to heal from, some that you may not be able to. The differentiating of those makes certain attacks far more lethal than others. If you're playing Werewolf and somebody's attacking you with a silver weapon, for instance, stuff just got real. Even if it's a normal person with a silver knife, they could end you with a lucky blow, possibly. Unless you're an extremely skilled wolf, that could be an issue. Now, some of the games are very, very abstract. That do not want to be realistic in any way. The Star Wars D6 system, for example, has a stunned level of injury, where you just have a penalty because you're shaken from a near injury. There's wounded, and I believe in the second edition, if not the first, there's a second level of wounding that you can take. It's basically like being stunned all the time, but you have an injury to yourself that you have to be mindful of. That either slows you down or the pain of it distracts you. The second level does twice as much. It takes 2 dice away from anything that you do. And it also lets you know that you're bleeding. You're in rough shape. Another good shot like that, and you could be down on the ground. After that, your characters are incapacitated. And if you take any more damage, you're mortally wounded and could die. So there's no character that can take ridiculous amounts of damage. All they can do is hope to deflect it. And in a game with lightsabers and blasters and vibroblades, deadly weapons by any standard, the ability to deflect rather than absorb punishment is really what becomes important. Now, to take a game that it tries to be even more realistic, on the other side, you have a game like GURPS. And if you've heard me before, you know I love GURPS. GURPS has a deflection system for your armor you have. The third edition had a passive defense that helped you dodge. It helped blows bounce off. But then it also had a damage reduction so that if a blow hits armor, the armor takes a certain amount of the punishment off first, possibly completely obviating the injury at all. The better armor, your plates or your chainmails, were better against slashes and scrapes. Whereas somebody shooting with a gun is probably going to be able to get through primitive armor. And for those who like realism, it is a fairly decent realistic system without having to have lots and lots of formulas and tables. It's relatively straightforward. You compare numbers, you roll damage, you subtract off however much damage, and then you directly apply it. There are the potentials for hit points as well as more realistic damage in GURPS. They do have an optional hit point system for people who want to do a more cinematic system. As a matter of fact, I just got their Dungeon Fantasy, which is an attempt to put a cinematic Dungeons and Dragons-like spin on their already good fantasy world. But if you don't use the hit point system, combat is deadly. If you take a wound, say somebody slashes you with a sword, say they hit you where you don't have any armor, and almost nobody is completely armored everywhere. If they hit you in, say, the eye slit of your armor, most people have to see, and they don't have any kind of plastic shielding, so there is some open space there. But realistically, if, say, you're wearing a chainmail vest and you get slashed on the arm with a sword, that becomes pretty serious. Number one, the stronger I am, the more damage that I'm going to deal with my sword. It's all based off of that. If you don't have any armor, and I do end up hitting you, you're going to take the damage, and each of your limbs has a certain amount of punishment they can take before they're crippled and can't be used anymore. But because I'm using a sword, which is a slashing weapon, because of the efficiency of using this lever to part flesh, or actually it's a wedge, to part flesh, any damage that I do is increased half again as much. So if I just do a cut that does, say, 4 points of damage, not unrealistic for a person who's... it would be a pretty weak hit for me, but that's all right. 4 points of damage. That arm is actually going to take 6 points of damage if there's no armor there to deflect my blow. And for most people, that can be a wound that is, if not crippling, close to crippling. And you can actually have blood loss and things like that. The game gets as realistic as you want it to be. Lots of optional rules. If you use all of them, it can get very grim very quickly. So, and you track how much damage that limb has taken. So if I slash it again, the damage is cumulative, and eventually the arm could just be hanging there from too much punishment. Potentially even being completely severed. And when you could do things like that to somebody, you can have a very graphic end to a fight if you've chopped a person's limb off. Monty Python notwithstanding. So the way of wrestling around hit points, when role-playing games first came out, almost every system used hit points or some system of hit points. The abstraction was useful. These games gladly accepted the convention because they allowed the game to be run without a great deal of extra tables and extra conversions and formulas that you would have to use to figure out how much punishment a person can take. When you're out of hit points, you're out of the fight. That's how it went. So all these other systems have tap danced around them. Some of them are even more abstract. Some of them cling to realism. And GURPS is not even the most realistic system. I've played a few others. If I remember right, Twilight 2000 had a pretty gritty system. Considering you were dealing a lot with guns and grenades and such, death could come rather quickly in that game. So, hit points are, some would say, a necessary evil. I say they're a convention to be embraced. I like being able to have on my GM control sheet the character and then however many hit points they can take. In Werewolf, it's just how many wounds they can take. And I can go with that without having to bog myself down with they took this hit where, this hit where. If I'm doing GURPS, my control sheet has to be a lot more sophisticated. I have to have how much health that person has, and then generally keep track of individual areas where they're injured for characters that matter. You can often bypass that and kind of assume that all of your henchmen are going to just be hit in the torso where you don't have to track lingering injuries. And save that for the creatures and opponents that are going to matter. But if you want to go very realistic, a system like that is going to be more complicated for the game master tackling it, and the players tackling it too. The players have to keep track of the damage their characters take, and since every combat in the game is going to involve their characters for the most part, they're going to have to do a lot of bookkeeping in their characters. So, if you want as much realism as possible, yeah, hit points aren't going to be that. So the challenge, though, of hit points, there is a payoff, of course. As much as they do for a game, they also challenge a game master. Because unlike a game like, say, I've used Final Fight before. If you've played Final Fight, you'll know that it's a fairly straightforward beat-em-up, side-scrolling, enemies come in, you hit the buttons, throw punches, maybe grab and slam opponents, but it's relatively straightforward. Gang members come in, many of them look the same, you just keep beating through them until you get all the way through the game. Great for swallowing up your quarters. In a home console, it's just a great way of blowing off some stress. As far as a game like that, you can see when you hit the opponent, they keel over, or you can see the impact, and there's usually a satisfying thud. Or if you grab somebody and jump up in the air and do a spinning pile driver on them, there's an impact and a feel to those games. The good ones, at least. There are some bad ones that don't give you even that, but in a good solid game like that uses something of a hit point system, there are ways of showing when you are inflicting damage. In a game of the mind, in a role-playing game, the game master who uses hit points is going to be challenged to take that abstraction, those hit points of damage, and the damage that's being done to those hit points, and they have to spin that narratively to keep the combats interesting. You have to be able to make the players understand that that 12-point slash, that murderous blow, why didn't it take its opponent down if they've got 35 hit points? It's a tremendous blow, but the character didn't have their vitals in the way to get slashed when that blow came in. If they have 35 hit points and they just took 12 points of damage in my game, it generally goes, the blow is deflected by armor, they couldn't get out of the way of it, but they were able to turn it from hitting them full force, so that they are dazed or bruised, perhaps. And you come up with a whole thesaurus worth of ways of describing injuries and blows, and try to draw the drama into what could be a very dry exchange of numbers. It's tough. It can be difficult, especially for a starting game master who's already trying to struggle with controlling all the different aspects. Once you get some experience, once you've become comfortable with a system, the challenge is making the story as engaging as possible to keep your players interested, and letting them know that, yeah, you just did 70 points of damage. It's amazing. You did a tremendous blow that would kill any lesser creature. But this creature has extremely thick scales and a bad attitude. And while you've drawn blood, which is more than most warriors who've ever faced this dragon, your blow didn't sink through to the vital organs that this blow would have definitely cleft through a lesser opponent. But no, your blow injured the dragon and drew his attention. It was an amazing blow. Just not enough to draw that creature into peril of its life. Started the process, perhaps. Now the dragon has been injured. He is now bleeding. He does now have to consider that mortality is possible. Anybody who does that much damage at one shot, which I've seen before, has to be considered a threat to any creature, even as mighty as a dragon, in almost any circumstance. So portraying what damage means in an abstract system, that's the challenge that we have, isn't it? And it's a skill. It is a definite skill, and it is a difference between, in a lot of cases, very boring combats. You did 12 points of damage to the dragon? Okay, 12 points of damage. Alright, you're next. Yeah, you hit. Okay, you dealt 8 points of damage to him. Okay, you hit him with your mace. You hit him. He's been hit. He takes 8 points of damage. That's dry. That's kind of dull. It doesn't give your players any sense of the impact or the immediacy. Now, another difficulty is on the player's end. If the players are taking damage, they're going to kind of want to know what the abstractions mean themselves. And unless you're personally tracking how many hit points the players have, on top of doing all your work tracking the hit points of the monsters, it's kind of hard to accurately narrate the damage the players take. I know players that get very defensive when you ask them how many hit points their characters have, because then maybe they're worried, maybe he's fudging his dice, getting me closer to death because he wants me to die, or maybe he's holding back because he doesn't want my character to die. Both situations can feel that's no longer a convention. That's the DM fudging. That may be their fears that you are tipping your hand. But in many cases, if the players trust you, it's not that big of a deal. The other option, of course, is to keep running tabs on how many hit points your players have. There could be side benefits on that if your players aren't accurately recording their damage, but for the most part, it's to help your narration so that you can tell them that 30 points of damage they just took got them down to, say, 3 hit points. That was a major blow that they almost killed them with the shot, but they just got away with a badly bleeding wound, maybe a sucking chest wound from that Gorgon's charge, or maybe their arm is hanging limp from a shattering blow that wrecked their shield from that frost giant's axe. Tough. Rather tough. There's one other aspect of hit points and one of the disadvantages of their use that comes up, and that is lasting injury. In a hit point system, much like in a movie, the heroes never get a lasting injury. No broken bones, no limbs chopped off. They stay at full combat effectiveness until they're actually dead. This is a major problem for the people who don't like the convention. My games, the way that I see them more as a story like a movie, it's not as big of an issue. And sometimes the players do get injured, and I do have on-the-fly things when they get injured from, say, a long fall, or the opponent gets a critical. They may have some injury that lingers until that amount of damage has been restored. Sometimes through rest, if the healing that they have is strong enough, perhaps through a quick spell. Certainly in Dungeons & Dragons, miraculous healing can occur. But in general, your character will never really be in danger of that. Whereas the DM, narrating exciting combats, may say, yeah, you've chopped off the goblin's arm, or you've smashed his collarbone. And rather than keeping track of the injury, you're just narrating, a character that's down to low hit points that has been hit. Again, it's a bit of a challenge. For some people, keeping track of details like that is relatively straightforward. When I do narrate rather extreme injuries, I write little notes in my combat log on characters so that A character that just had his collarbone smash is not going to do some tremendous two-handed axe handle smash on your opponent. They may get a desperation blow in that clubs them in the neck or something instead to represent a great blow, but it's not going to be something tremendously powerful from a character who's already injured. Again, comes with experience. I've been doing this for 30 years, so for me it's a little bit easier. For others, bear in mind, hit points make your jobs a lot easier. They do. But if you're going to tell an exciting story, you still have to find a way to make them come to life. And that is both sides of the hit point table. The pros and the cons. We've looked at both. Hit points aren't going away. Certainly in video games, many of them use hit points more now than ever. Mostly heads-up displays and bars on your screen are used graphically rather than having a numerical system, but it's just so useful of a convention for games with the same assumptions. If you're playing Halo and you have your sniper rifle and you shoot somebody in the arm, they lose hit points. But their arm isn't shattered, it doesn't fall off. Very few games have that level of detail. And they have that same convention going, that your character will be able to fight until you're actually dead on the ground, because it works for that game. Afford role-playing games the same courtesy. So that's my take on hit points and why people who have a problem with hit points have some good points on their side. But for the most part, it's something that we've just learned to live with, and it's a comfortable allowance that we make for a system that allows our games to come to life before our very eyes. So now that we've explored that in detail, I think we're due for a bit of treasure, don't you? Anyone who knows me knows that I love dragons. The fact that dragons are the iconic creature of many fantasy role-playing games, including the granddaddy of them all, it's no real surprise or accident that this is the way it's come. Dragons are a somewhat universal creature that has passed through many, many different cultures, almost to the point of being universal. Some form of a dragon or another is in just about every culture. And they are alternatively seen as very, very powerful, sometimes very, very wise, sometimes truly wicked and irredeemable, sometimes good and guardians of the just. They can be what the culture needs them to be. And I love them. I really do. I love using them as characters in my stories. I like them being the puppet masters controlling things behind the scenes. I like them being an ultimate challenge for a group as a reward for a great campaign. Getting to take on a dragon in an epic battle and claiming its hoard is, it's a tremendous thing to have. And even in games that don't have dragons themselves, oftentimes there are ways of inserting draconian influences into them. So I do love them, and I always have. I love them in literature. One of the first books I've ever read, back when I was just a little scamp, my mom read to me The Hobbit, Tolkien's classic, and Smaug just filled my imagination. The idea of this massive, flying, fire-breathing lizard with, millennia of experience and knowledge and magic and power and being an indestructible force that only the greatest of heroes could actually challenge. But once they're slain, it's the ultimate prize. They have all this that they've gathered up because that's the way they are. They're hoarders and collectors. Well, I love dragons. So I have collected a great number of dragons. I've found some to be absolutely fantastic. The lines that Wizards of the Coast have put out with their, or I think they're using WizKids for them, but the dragon figures that they have are very nice, very, very fine. The huge dragons are tremendous, of which I only have one or two, because I use them so seldomly. They're rather expensive too. I have the highlight of my collection is the Apocalypse Dragon from Mage Knight. You may see it from time to time. It's the big 5-headed dragon. I use that as my XP for Tiamat. It's fun, and scale-wise, it's pretty good too. But one of the earlier dragons that I had back before they had all these pre-painted, I got a nice multi-piece figure, and it turned out really well, and I was really happy. This was from the time before gold dragons were the Oriental style with the long snake-like body and such. I thought I'd show this one to you. Even though I painted this a long, long time ago, he still managed to keep this rich golden luster. All of my coloring I do, when I do colors, I do all of the colors freehand. I just squirt some ink into my mixing trough and take all of the different colors. I don't note formulas and things that I know that real honest-to-goodness painters do. But it generally is a system that's worked out pretty well for me. I'm proud of this guy. I don't get to use him very often. But he's just a beautiful dragon, and I'm very proud of it. But you know what? Can't have everything all the time. So why don't you take this golden dragon statuette? If you play with me in one of my games, just remind me that you have it. Note it on your character sheet. And who knows? Maybe in the game it might do something for you. For those of you who are interested, I have now created a mega dungeon called the Chimeric Dungeon of Fondlak. Fondlak. It's a city in my world of Moltra, which I will tell you about. It's my latest fantasy realm. Just a quick overview. The entire world is covered by molten lava, and the only life that's on the world is on the back of giant swimming worms that endlessly swim around this planet, and they cast their consciousness and their life force into the life that springs up off their backs, and it fits the personality of the dragon, the kind of life that springs up. I set about to create a world that's as far from the fantasy worlds of Gygax and Tolkien and Greenwood as I could, and I think it works pretty well. So I have just opened my mega dungeon, and I do occasional I will be doing occasional openings of the dungeon so that people can come and take a whack at my dungeon. Generally, I'm going to shoot for the first Wednesday of each month, and it will be taking place in the Chimera Hobby Shop on Main Street in Fond du Lac. As I said, every first Wednesday of the month. I will be making a Facebook page and posting events and possibly stories and tips and things like that about it. We are currently using Swords and Wizardry Lite, but I'm about to do something that I've never heard of before, and I'm willing to try it. I'm going to open up my dungeon to any game system that you pull up that's fantasy-based that I've ever heard of. So if somebody comes in with their first level 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons character, somebody comes in with their 1st edition Dungeons & Dragons character, somebody doesn't come in with a character at all, they can make a Swords and Wizardry Lite character, and I'll run them all at the same time. I can do this. I'm pretty sure I can do this. And until the point where I can't, I will admit it and we'll figure something out. But at the very least, at the lowest levels, I'm absolutely positive that I can handle it, as long as I know the rules that you're using. Should be fun. I can't wait to see a character from Pathfinder rubbing shoulders with the Swords and Wizardry Lite being backed up by a cleric from 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. That could be a lot of fun. Because I know how to scale monsters, and I know how to scale challenges, and I know the relative strengths and weaknesses of the different systems, so I think this will be a lot of fun. Worst case scenario, I limit it down to 1, and we just have a great time in a big dungeon. So I will also be relating things from how my mega dungeon is going to you through my Lair of OmnusI videos and other videos as we go. So game on, as they say. If you watch my videos and you are gathering the treasure, that could give you a little bit of a leg up. Certainly against some of the life and death situations that you might see. But in addition to that, why don't you take 15 Lair points for today for your experiences and such. Make sure that's all on the character sheet too. I'm OmnusI, thank you for joining me here in my lair. We're open for business again. I look forward to seeing you in my next Lair of OmnusI. Please, if you enjoyed this, consider subscribing. And if you hit that subscribe button, the next time I put out another video, you'll be alerted so you won't miss any. Thanks for watching, and I hope you have many profitable ventures. Farewell.